we're going to talk about cognition and behavior. And initially, I know this might come across as quite a theoretical night, but there's a lot of practical aspects to tonight. And I know you're probably looking at your notes and thinking they're the longest set of notes so far. And it's probably because there's a lot of detail that we have to cover tonight. And you've got some supplementary material that we'll talk about. So up until this point in this lecture series, we've spoken about what a Christian counsellor looks like and the characteristics of a Christian counsellor, and we've spoken about compassionate understanding and what that means and what the importance of the embodiment of that in a Christian counsellor. And from there, we've moved on to help our clients tell their stories, and we've used basic and advanced empathy to do that. And in doing that, we've started to explore their attachments and their emotions and the impact that this is having on their life. And so the time has now come to start to explore what lies behind those emotions, to start to correct the force behind the emotions and ultimately behind the behavior that's causing these emotions, or that is happening as a result of these emotions. And that force and that those core beliefs or thoughts are what we're going to talk about tonight as cognition or thinking. And if you want to think about it in very simplistic terms, we have our thoughts or our core beliefs, and they drive our emotions, as we spoke about last week, which then fuels our actions. And I think if you think about it in that sequential way, it makes it a lot easier to understand the relationship between all the different methods of counselling that we're talking about. A lot of people think that if you're a cognitive behavioural therapist, for example, if you only deal with the mind and the behaviour, then you do that and you do that purely. Or if you're someone who has a person-centered approach and you want to deal with clients at an emotional level, then you only deal with emotions. And if you're someone who wants to have an emotionally focused approach, again, you only deal with the emotions and what they mean. But I've found through dealing with and through learning from successful counsellors, and I found in my own experience that it's actually an eclectic approach, or an approach that incorporates a lot of theories and places them in a way that they can be used together, that they're not in opposition of one another. So we can start with a client with empathy and basic, compassionate understanding, and that empathy will get them talking about their emotions, which will lead us to their thought process. And in doing that, we've used 3 or 4 different kinds of schools of counselling, or theories of counselling, so to speak. And so tonight we want to talk about cognition and behaviour. And I think it's really important to start to understand what they are first before we start to delve into how we're going to do that. Cognition is defined as the mental process of knowing something, and it includes aspects like awareness, perception, reasoning, judgment, that which comes to be known as through perception, reasoning or intuition. It's about knowledge. So cognition talks about what we think we know, our logic, our reasoning, our core beliefs, which we'll talk about in a lot more detail. Behaviour is defined as the manner we conduct ourselves, the things that we actually do. One definition is anything that an organism does involving action and response to stimulation. And another definition is the response of an individual, group or species to its environment. So our behaviour is very much related to our cognition, because ultimately how we behave is driven again by what we think and what we believe and what our core beliefs are. And so the cognitive behavioural school of thought described the relationship between cognition and emotion and behaviour as a combination that determines the way an individual will cope in times of stress. So when a person has a difficult time in their life, things automatically go into action, and some of those things are what we really believe about ourselves, what we really believe about others, what we really believe about the world around us, start to influence how we feel and ultimately how we behave, like we touched on last week. And what a person believes about what he thinks is very important. So if I believe that my thoughts are absolute and they're true and that must be the way it is, and I'm very regimented in my thinking, that's going to also affect how open I am to change in my thinking or to questioning my thought process. And also how an event is interpreted determines how an individual responds to it. One example a lot of times we use in therapy is we put in front of someone a yellow lemon, right? And we give them a blue cellophane paper, and we ask them to look through the blue cellophane paper and tell us what the colour of the lemon is. And it's green, it's no longer yellow. And it's just to demonstrate that our perception, how we view things, changes how we react to them, changes how we deal with the situation, influences what we say and how we feel about a particular event. So it's those ideas, it's those cognitions, it's those core beliefs that fuel our emotions and ultimately turn us to act in or behave in certain ways. And so cognitive intervention, or this style of therapy or this theory, is an attempt to produce change, to start to ask the person to consider different ways of thinking that may be not as unhealthy as or healthier than those thought processes that they may have had in the past. And by doing that, their beliefs and their responses to them change. Now, I know that when I say beliefs, a lot of us think of faith, but that's not what I mean in this situation. I'm talking about our beliefs as in our ideas about ourselves and others. And sometimes there's a bit of a blurry line between what really is our faith and what we are really taught and what we think we're taught. So a classic example is when we're taught about repentance, it doesn't mean that we need to have a low self-esteem or we need to hate ourselves. But a lot of the times there is confusion there, that a person may believe that in order for me to be a good Christian, in order for me to repent, I must hate myself, and in the sense that I no longer appreciate myself as a creation of God. And it becomes an unbalanced view of oneself. Rather than a balanced view of I can do all things through Christ, it becomes I can do nothing, regardless of whether it's through Christ or anyone else. And it stops there. And that's why it's called beliefs, because it is a very fine line, but I'm not speaking here about theological beliefs, so to speak. So moving from there, we want to talk a little bit about what cognitive behavioural therapy looks like, and then we'll start to look at how those thoughts, how those cognitions are layered and are broken up. And the person who started the thought of cognitive therapy is Beck. And one of his assumptions is that there is a fundamental link between the way individuals feel and behave and the way they view themselves, the world around them, and their future. So by identifying and evaluating and modifying distorted or dysfunctional thinking and beliefs, a person then can gain greater control over a person's emotion and ultimately their behaviour. And so this idea actually is not new, and it's quite biblical. If you think of the verse where in Philippians we're asked to, whatever is true, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. So even the Bible is very supportive of this theory that we need to be thinking in a positive way, in a constructive way. And cognitive behavioural therapy or cognitive therapy aims to alleviate the destructive thought patterns that a person might have. So another person, not in the Bible, but even before that, a Roman philosopher called Epictetus once said that men are disturbed not by events, but by the view they take of them. And I go back to that example about that woman with the premature baby, and if you remember, we've carried this through in terms of how two individuals have the same situation and can have a totally different outlook. A person's view, a person's perception of the events is usually the cause of the problem, not the event itself. So the main focus of CBT is to teach clients to identify, evaluate, and modify non-constructive thinking and behavioural patterns, so to help them to better manage their mood and behavioural options. So a lot of people think if we're going to talk about cognition, if we're going to talk about the mind, and if we're going to talk about the way a person thinks, that it's not related to emotion. But it is very much related to emotion, because it is what drives our emotion. And this process of CBT involves the assessment of cognitive, so thought, affective, emotion, social, behavioural, biological and environmental factors. It brings into the picture all influences a person might have in their life. And initially it appears like a directive approach. It appears that the counsellor or the person that's helping gives direction and lets the person know which path to take, and the questions that are asked appear to be a bit directive. But the aim of CBT is that over time that approach softens and the person is actually empowered to go away and to be able to resolve other issues in their life. So it's a very short-term, simple therapy method or helping method for our purposes. And because of that, the client and the counsellor have to work together to evaluate the evidence for whatever conclusions that the person has in their life, whatever beliefs or ideas the person has with their life. So the main focus or the main indication of success in CBT or in cognitive behavioural therapy is that therapeutic alliance, that relationship between the counsellor and the client. The counsellor and the client have a good relationship, have a relationship where empathy is present, have a relationship where there's non-judgment, where there is unconditional positive regard, then that is a very strong indicator that CBT can work and it can be a successful method to use with someone. It's also very goal-oriented. In the onset of a cognitive behavioural approach, a client is generally asked the reason that they've come to counselling and what they want to achieve by going through the counselling process. And a little bit later on, I actually have a video of a session, or it's a shortened session of a CBT, and you will see that from the very beginning, the counsellor asks the client, well, what is it that you're here for? What can I help you with? Why is it that you've come to counselling? What do you want to achieve? Very much the thinking is that it's up to the person to decide the path that they want to take and what they want to improve on. So at no point in time, and even though we're talking about core beliefs and ideas, does the counsellor impose their ideas or their own core beliefs on the person that they're dealing with. And it's also an educative and skill building method. It's not one where there is a dependence on the counsellor. It's a method that actually can be used by anybody, and a lot of the tools that I've given you in the notes that you have are things you can actually go away and either give to someone or use to work on your own with very little assistance from someone else, because it's quite a simple, direct method to go about analysing the way we think and what we think of ourselves and others. And it uses what's called a rational and an experiential approach. So what that means is it's very rational, it's very logical. The things that are suggested in the CBT approach are almost common sense, and it's experiential in that the client is often invited to go away and to try the behaviours that they feel would suit them or that would best fit their new core beliefs or their adjusted core beliefs, and come back and report on them and work through them. So there's actually the experience side of it, not just the theory and the talking behind it. And even though it's concerned with cognition and behaviour, a counsellor, like I said, has to remain empathic throughout the process. So emotions will still come up, and the counsellor still needs to know how to talk through them and how to go through the basic and the advanced empathy process to go and reach the underlying core beliefs that a person has about themselves, their genuine fears, their real insecurities, and so on. And like I said, it aims to put the client in charge as much as possible. So that's basically, in very brief, a summary of what CBT or cognitive behavioural therapy looks like on the outside. So there are some basic assumptions, there are some basic things that are part of this cognitive behavioural school or way of thinking. And the first one is that individuals actively construct their own reality by selecting, filtering and interpreting environmental and internal messages, or by attaching highly personal, idiosyncratic meanings to events. That's very wordy, but basically what it means is people ultimately interpret things in the way that they choose to. A person can walk into this room and can see something completely different to another person walking into exactly the same room. I can speak to one person one way and they may think that there's nothing to read into, and I can speak to another person another way and think, wow, she's really cold and distant and not really listening to me. And it's very much about how that person perceives the situation, how they interpret and construct their own reality. So that's the first one. The second assumption is cognition is knowable and accessible with basic aptitude and training to access the products and processes of faulty information processing. Again, wordy, but in everyday language, that's basically saying that our thought process is not so complex that we can't sit down and analyze it and think about it and work out where it is that these thoughts and these beliefs come from. It's something that we can know and that we can access with relative ease. And cognition change, number 3, is central to the human change process. The cognition mediates affect, motivation and behaviour. This is the key assumption of CBT. As we grow in our faith and as we grow in our Christianity, we're challenged. And as we are challenged, we over time change our views, or our views grow and improve about many things in our life, including our faith. So if you take a child and you speak to them about their faith and speak to that child, 20 years later, their views and their faith hopefully would have deepened, and their understanding would have deepened as a result. And so what this is saying is that the same applies to other areas of our life. That to change the way we think is central, is of utmost importance in human improvement. If I continue to think in the same way that I thought as a child, if I don't challenge my thinking, then I cannot improve myself as a human being. Number 4 is the negativity hypothesis, which postulates that a significant increase in negative thinking concerning the self, world and future is present in all types of depression and in at least 50% of depressed individuals. So what that's saying is a person who's depressed generally has negative thinking about themselves, others and the world and the environment that they live in. We could easily add God in there as well. And that again is pretty common sense. It's very rare to find a depressed person with positive thoughts about any of these things. Number 5, the primacy hypothesis assumes that biased cognition, information processing, usually corresponding change in the individual's emotional and behavioural responding. So it assumes that if I think in a certain way, if I see things as being negative, then I'm going to find evidence for that. I saw like a jigsaw puzzle, an image of a jigsaw puzzle, and if you can imagine where a person's central core beliefs is negative. So, everyone hates me, for example, and the pieces that fit in there are all square, and all the negative things that happen in life are square shaped, but all the positive things are circular shaped. So none of the circular shaped pieces are going to ever fit in, because I have this underlying belief that I'm hopeless or nobody likes me or whatever that negative belief is. So no matter what positives happen in life, they're not going to fit into my underlying belief. So I can ignore them. I can pretend that they're not there. And that's this hypothesis. Number 6, the cognitive content specificity hypothesis. I know this is very theoretical, but assumes that every psychological disorder has a distinctive cognitive profile which is reflected at all levels of processing. So a perceived loss can lead to depression, a perceived threat, anxiety, and beliefs of injustice, anger. So again, what I believe and what I think, and if I think that I'm persecuted and I'm discriminated against in every area of my life, then again I'm going to find evidence for that, and I'm going to constantly feel belittled and threatened in my life, regardless of what happens in it. Number 7, the last one, is the cognitive diathesis or stress hypothesis, which emphasizes the specific stresses for sociotropic and autonomous personality types. So what that means is there are some people out there that when things happen outside of them, that when other people do things that are negative, they internalize it. And that becomes something extremely stressful to them, even though it may not be related to them at all. But if someone somewhere makes a mistake or does something that they don't believe is right, it becomes a very traumatic event for them. And there's autonomous, which talks about the negative achievement events. There are people who, when they do something and they don't believe that it's a positive achievement, that has a catastrophic outcome for them and can severely affect their way of thinking or their mood or their temperament and ultimately their behaviour.